There are nights when the story of the wizarding world feels like a gentle current, carrying us slowly through memories. And tonight we follow that current into shadow. And if this quiet telling of the darker paths of magic brings you a little peace, feel free to stay, perhaps even subscribe, but only if it truly eases your rest. Share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is there. It feels almost like magic to know that, across distant corners of the world, others close their eyes to the same story, carried together for a moment by the echoes of Harry Potter's world. Long before the name Death Eater was whispered in fear, the roots of their story began in ideas older than Voldemort himself. The wizarding world had always carried division. Bloodlines, ancient and proud, were guarded like treasures, and there were those who believed that magic belonged only to the pure. Families like the Gaunts, descended from Salazar Slytherin, clung to their heritage as if it were gold, shrinking into decay, but never surrendering their pride. Their houses fell to ruin, their wealth crumbled to dust. Yet still they boasted of ancestry and despised those born of Muggles. From such soil, the seeds of the Death Eaters would one day grow. In those early centuries after Hogwarts was founded, fear of the non-magical world was not without cause. Witch hunts flared, torches lit the night, and secrecy became law. Wizards retreated behind charms and wards, building lives hidden in shadow. Some accepted this with patience, but others grew bitter. They saw in Muggles not only danger but weakness, and in themselves a right to rule. The belief that magical blood made one superior simmered quietly, passed from parent to child, from house to house, until it became tradition for some. By the 18th and 19th centuries, these ideas hardened. Families like the Blacks, the Lestrangers, the Malfoys, and others carried their pride in pure blood like armor. Some lived respectably, some cruelly, but all spoke in hushed voices of the difference between those of true blood and those who had come from non-magical families. It was not yet the name of Death Eater, but the soil of belief was already fertile for the day when someone would give it a banner to gather under. Dark magic, too, carried its own allure. The unforgivable curses had long been known, though feared. Spells that killed, that enslaved, that tortured, were whispered of in the restricted section of libraries and in the secret lessons of reckless wizards. Such magic promised power, but at the cost of the soul. It was in these darker corners that some pure-blood families lingered, studying rituals that most avoided, believing themselves strong enough to wield what others feared. The Gaunts, in their decaying shack in Little Hangleton, embodied the decay of pride. Without compassion, their line was thin, their tempers cruel, their lives ruled by obsession with the past. Merope Gaunt, broken and despised by her kin, would one day give birth to Tom Riddle, and in him the blood of Slytherin and the bitterness of centuries would fuse. His existence was no accident, but the final spark from a long lineage of arrogance and cruelty. So, the origin of the Death Eaters was not in a sudden gathering or a bold proclamation. It was in centuries of fear, pride, and secrecy, in families that believed themselves above others, in wizards who whispered of power that should not be shared. By the time Tom Riddle rose, the ground was ready for him. The ideas were already alive. All he did was give them form, give them purpose, give them a name that would carry terror into every home. Hogwarts itself, though built to unite all kinds of magic, could not erase such divisions. The Sorting Hat warned again and again of rivalry, of the need for unity, yet the houses often carried their pride like weapons. Slytherin House, with its history tied to Salazar, became the natural refuge of those who prized heritage above heart. Many who would later take the Dark Mark began their path in those dungeons, whispering of ancestry, dreaming of power. But the story of the Death Eaters was not only of families and tradition. It was also of individuals who chose cruelty over kindness, who believed that domination was strength, who found in Tom Riddle a leader who spoke their thoughts aloud. And so, as the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the pieces of their story were already waiting. The boy who would become Voldemort had not yet entered the world, but the soil for his rise was prepared. The night was waiting for its storm. The story of the Death Eaters cannot be told without first walking carefully through the childhood of the boy who would one day lead them. Tom Marvolo Riddle entered the world unloved and unwanted in a London orphanage, a child born of a broken union between the last of the Gaunt family and a wealthy muggle who fled in disgust when the enchantment binding him faded. His mother, Merope, died soon after his birth, leaving him alone in a grey building where magic was unknown and cruelty was common. From the start, Tom learned two lessons that would never leave him. He was different, and he was alone. Strange things happened around him even before Hogwarts. Other children feared him, animals obeyed him, and when he was angry, objects broke or bodies hurt without explanation. He was proud of these gifts even before he had words for them. He kept trophies from those he frightened, and he learned to smile politely while hiding the storm within. By the time Albus Dumbledore appeared at the orphanage to place a letter of admission in his hand, Tom already knew he was not like the others. What he did not yet know was that his difference was a heritage as old as Hogwarts itself. At 11 years old, he entered the castle and was sorted into Slytherin House. The sorting hat saw ambition burning in him like fire, cunning sharper than steel, and a hunger for greatness that refused to be denied. He could have gone elsewhere, for courage and cleverness both lived in him, but he wanted Slytherin, and the hat granted his choice. From that night, Tom Riddle walked the dungeons with the pride of a prince returning to his inheritance. At first he appeared to be the perfect student. Professors praised his brilliance, his quiet manners, his ability to master spells quickly. He became a favorite of Horace Slughorn, who gathered talented pupils into his Slug Club, and Tom shone brightest among them. To his peers he was charming when he wished to be, distant when he chose, and always in control. But beneath that polished surface lay the same pride that had burned in his ancestors. He despised weakness, mocked those he considered beneath him, and hid his cruelty in shadows where professors would not see. It was at Hogwarts that Tom began to gather followers. Other Slytherins admired him, drawn by his confidence and the aura of power he carried. He offered friendship, but in truth bound them with fear and manipulation. Some obeyed him out of admiration, others because they dared not resist. They were not yet called Death Eaters, but in them lay the first circle of his future army. During these years, Tom also began to search for his past. He discovered that he was descended from Salazar Slytherin through the Gaunt family, and the knowledge filled him with pride. He had always believed himself special, but now he believed himself chosen. When whispers of the Chamber of Secrets reached his ears, he did not dismiss them as legend. He knew they were truth waiting to be uncovered, and with patience he sought them out. The chamber was his first triumph. Speaking parcel-tongued, he opened what had been sealed for centuries, and in the basilisk he found a weapon more terrible than any spell. When Myrtle Warren died in the bathroom, Tom saw not tragedy but victory. He silenced suspicion by framing Hagrid, sacrificing another boy to protect himself. In doing so, he proved to himself that he could bend both people and history to his will. The chamber closed, but Tom's confidence opened wider than ever. As he grew older, his charm sharpened into something darker. He questioned Slughorn about Horcruxes, pressing for knowledge of how the soul might be divided to achieve immortality. Though Slughorn tried to hide the truth, Tom learned enough, and his path was set. He had no fear of splitting his soul, no hesitation at the thought of murder to anchor his life beyond death. The boy who had grown up alone in an orphanage now dreamed not only of power, but of eternity. By the time Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, he was already far more than a brilliant student. He was a leader, a manipulator, a seeker of secrets. His followers walked behind him like shadows, eager for his approval, fearful of his disfavor. Professors praised him, the ministry welcomed him, and the world saw only a young man destined for greatness. But those who looked deeper, and only Dumbledore truly did, saw the hunger in his eyes, the coldness in his smile, the emptiness where love should have lived. The rise of Tom Riddle at Hogwarts was not yet the rise of the Death Eaters, but the path was clear. The school that had been built to unite all magical children had given him the tools to divide, to charm, to command. And when he stepped out of its gates for the last time, he carried with him not only knowledge, but followers, not only ambition, but a vision of a world where fear was power and cruelty was strength. The seeds had been sown. The shadow of the Death Eaters was already beginning to stretch. When Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, he carried with him more than a wand and a diploma. He carried secrets, ambitions, and the beginnings of a circle that would one day call itself the Death Eaters. These first followers were not an army yet, not masked figures feared across Britain, but students who had once walked the same corridors, eaten at the same tables, and cheered at the same matches. To them, Tom was not only a friend, but a leader who seemed destined for greatness. During his final years at the castle, Tom had already drawn certain Slytherins close to him. They admired his charm, his mastery of spells, and the aura of control that seemed to radiate from him. Some were from proud families, pure bloodlines that had whispered for centuries of superiority. Others were weaker in spirit, drawn to him not by admiration but by fear. Tom never wasted kindness. He offered approval like a gift and withdrew it like punishment, teaching them that their worth depended on his favor. By the time they graduated, their loyalty was already bound. He had given them more than companionship. He had given them vision. He spoke of a world where wizards no longer needed to hide from muggles, where power was respected, where pure blood families would stand above all. To some, his words were intoxicating, confirming what they had always believed but never dared say aloud. To others, they were frightening, yet even fear bound them closer, for to resist Tom Riddle was to feel the sharp edge of his displeasure. After Hogwarts, Tom moved carefully. He worked at Borgin and Burke's, the shop that dealt in dark artifacts, and there he learned not only the secrets of dangerous objects, but also the greed of those who bought and sold them. He charmed customers, persuaded them to part with treasures, and gathered knowledge of curses and relics that others feared. His job gave him access to families, homes, and histories, and he used every opportunity to strengthen his network. In these years, he also began to reshape his own image. The name Tom Riddle tied him to a Muggle father he despised, and so he shed it. He crafted a new identity, pulling letters from his birth name until they formed the words, "I am Lord Voldemort." To his followers, he revealed this name with pride, telling them that the boy born in an orphanage was gone, replaced by the wizard who would one day change the world. To them it was a declaration of destiny, and they whispered the name with reverence and fear. The circle grew slowly at first. Former classmates brought friends, cousins, siblings. Families proud of their bloodlines welcomed him, offering sons and daughters to his cause. The Malfoys, the Lestranges, the Averys, the Knots, and others found in him a leader who spoke their language. To them, Voldemort promised power, respect, and a future where their pride would be honored. To others, he offered fear, and they obeyed because they dared not do otherwise. It was in this first circle that the rituals began. Meetings in darkened rooms, masks to hide their faces, oaths sworn in secret. The dark mark, the skull with a serpent winding through its mouth, became their symbol. Burned into their arms by Voldemort's own hand, it bound them together, a brand that marked them as his forever. To the world, they were not yet known. But to themselves, they were no longer just followers. They were his army in the making. The first acts of cruelty were small, almost unremarkable in history, yet heavy with meaning. Intimidation of muggles, curses whispered in alleys, disappearances that were never explained. Each act tested loyalty, hardened resolve, and taught the followers that mercy had no place among them. Voldemort watched, rewarding those who obeyed without hesitation, punishing those who faltered with cold precision. By these trials, the weak fell away, and the strong remained. Some joined out of conviction, truly believing in the purity of blood and the right of wizards to rule. Others joined for fear, desperate to avoid becoming targets themselves. And still others joined for ambition, seeing in Voldemort a path to power they could never claim alone. No matter their reasons, once they bore the dark mark, their fates were tied. Thus the first circle of the Death Eaters was formed, not yet known to the wider world, but already loyal to a leader who saw himself not as a man, but as a destiny. In dimly lit chambers, in whispers carried by owl and by word of mouth, they pledged themselves to Lord Voldemort, and though history would remember them for their terror, in these first years they were remembered only by each other, bound by secrecy and ambition, waiting for the day when their master would lead them into the open. The castle they had left behind still stood tall, its children laughing in corridors, its staircases shifting, its sorting hats singing of unity. Few knew that within those same stones a boy had once gathered shadows, and that those shadows had now spread into the world beyond. Hogwarts had raised Tom Riddle, and Tom Riddle had raised followers who would one day drape the wizarding world in fear. When Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, he did not step into the world as other graduates did, with hopes of careers or families. He stepped into it as a predator entering a larger hunting ground. He had charmed professors, impressed classmates, and left behind a record of brilliance. Yet what he carried with him was more than knowledge of spells. He carried secrets of the soul, ambitions sharpened like blades, and a hunger that would not be satisfied until he had bound the wizarding world beneath his will. At first, he remained close to home, taking work at Borgin and Burke's, where he handled cursed objects, rare relics, and items steeped in dark history. To those who watched him, he was polite, even charming, a young man of promise who had chosen to study antiques. In truth, he was hunting. Each object brought him closer to forgotten magics. Each family he visited revealed doors into hidden vaults. Each transaction gave him more knowledge of what power lay in the shadows. He persuaded elderly witches and wizards to part with treasures they barely understood, and some of those treasures would later become anchors for his immortality. But Tom's hunger stretched beyond Britain. He vanished for years, traveling across Europe and beyond, following trails of dark lore wherever they led. Some spoke of him in Albania, wandering forests, heavy with ancient magic. Others whispered of his time in Egypt, where tombs held curses older than Hogwarts itself. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, in villages that feared even the sound of his footsteps, he studied rituals meant to bind life and death. His travels were cloaked in mystery, but every place he touched left stories of strange disappearances, of shadows, where once there had been none. It was during these years that he began to shape himself into something more than Tom Riddle. He experimented with Horcruxes, splitting his soul through murder, binding fragments of it into objects of significance. The diary he had already prepared, a record of himself as a boy, ready to be used as both weapon and key to the Chamber of Secrets. A ring from the Gaunt family, heavy with history and curse, became another. Other relics followed, treasures tied to the founders of Hogwarts, trophies stolen or taken by cunning persuasion. Each Horcrux cost him a piece of humanity, yet he felt no loss, only triumph, for each made him harder to destroy. His body began to change as well, at first subtly, his features sharpening, his skin paling. But as the years went on and the rituals deepened, he shed the handsome face of Tom Riddle for something colder, less human, shaped by the darkness he embraced. He had always despised his Muggle father's blood, and in abandoning his own appearance, he abandoned that part of himself. He was becoming Voldemort, and he welcomed the transformation. During his travels, his influence spread. The followers he had gathered at Hogwarts remained loyal, waiting for his return, whispering his name to others. When he reappeared in Britain, he was no longer a gifted young man with a promising future. He was Lord Voldemort, cloaked in fear, his very presence commanding obedience. His followers gathered again, more numerous, more devoted, bound by the dark mark he seared into their flesh. What had begun as a circle of students had grown into a brotherhood of terror. The wizarding world was not blind to his return. The Ministry of Magic watched uneasily, but Voldemort was clever. He did not move openly at first. He placed followers in positions of influence, charmed allies into silence, and built his network with patience. He was not rushing toward power. He was building a foundation that would last. By the end of these years, Voldemort was ready. He had traveled the world, stolen from the past, split his soul, reshaped his body, and gathered his followers. He had cast away the name Tom Riddle, buried with the Muggle father he despised, and risen as Lord Voldemort, a figure who seemed less a man than a shadow given flesh. And behind him stood his followers, ready to become the Death Eaters, ready to bring terror to every corner of the wizarding world. The world did not yet know it, but the First War was already beginning. By the time Tom Riddle returned from his travels, the boy was gone, and the shadow of Lord Voldemort had taken his place. He no longer hid behind the mask of a polite young wizard with perfect manners. He stepped into Britain with new followers, new power, and a new vision for the future. It was in these years that his circle gained its name, the name that would send fear into every home, the name that children would whisper only in shivers, the Death Eaters. The origin of the name was never explained by Voldemort himself. Some believed it meant that his followers devoured the lives of others, feasting on their deaths as proof of power. Others thought it was tied to his obsession with conquering death, that his servants were marked as those who followed him in that quest. Whatever its meaning, the name was simple, sharp, and terrible. It branded his followers not as men and women, but as predators, shadows who fed on fear. Voldemort gave his servants more than a name. He gave them a mark that burned into their skin, a brand of loyalty that could never be erased. The Dark Mark, a skull with a serpent sliding from its mouth, was seared into the left forearm of every follower. When Voldemort touched his own, the others felt it burn, summoning them across distance, binding them with pain and fear. It was both a symbol and a leash. For those who wore it, there was no turning back. The masks came soon after. Pale, expressionless, they hid the faces of his followers, turning them into a faceless legion. To the victims of their raids, it did not matter who stood behind the mask. What mattered was the skull in the sky, the emerald green serpent twisting above homes set aflame, the sign that death had come and mercy would not. The Dark Mark was more than a brand on flesh. It was a symbol written across the sky, a promise of terror that lingered long after the Death Eaters had gone. Their philosophy was rooted in old beliefs, sharpened into cruelty by Voldemort's hand. They spoke of blood purity, of the superiority of those born into wizarding families, of the danger of allowing Muggle-borns to dilute magic. Yet beneath these words lay simpler truths. They wanted power, and they followed Voldemort because he gave it. Some believed fully in his cause. Others obeyed out of fear, but all were bound to him, their loyalty branded into their skin, their lives bent to his will. The rituals of the Death Eaters grew darker as their circle expanded. Meetings were held in abandoned manors, in forests under moonlight, in hidden chambers lit only by green fire. They swore oaths in whispers, drank from goblets that shimmered with cursed potions, and pledged themselves body and soul to their master. Voldemort's presence bound them together, his voice smooth and cold, his commands absolute. None dared disobey, for his punishments were swift and merciless. The Cruciatus Curse was his favorite tool, twisting screams into lessons that would never be forgotten. Families of influence joined his cause. The Malfoys, wealthy and proud, lent their gold and their name. The Lestranges, fervent and fanatical, gave him loyalty that bordered on worship. The Averys, the Knots, the Carrows, and many others pledged their wands. Even those who doubted at first were drawn in. For to resist Voldemort was to place oneself in mortal danger. Better, many thought, to bow than to break. And so the circle grew, their masks multiplying, their marks burning bright. The Death Eaters became not only Voldemort's followers, but his army. They moved where he commanded, struck when he ordered, and carried out acts of cruelty that made his name a curse. Their raids left families destroyed, their spells tore lives apart, and their laughter echoed in the silence they left behind. The wizarding world had seen dark wizards before, but never an organized legion bound so closely to one master. In the quiet years of their rise, before the war burned openly, the Death Eaters practiced fear like an art. They spread whispers, sent warnings, and left signs where all could see them. A skull over a cottage, a family missing without trace, a body found with eyes wide and lifeless. Every act was designed not only to destroy but to terrify. For Voldemort knew that fear was stronger than force, and his followers became the instruments of that fear. Thus the name Death Eater became more than a title. It became a shadow that fell over Britain, a reminder that Voldemort's reach was long and his servants many. Those who bore the mark could not escape it, and those who saw it knew that death was close. The wizarding world would never be the same again. The Death Eaters began their rise not with a single grand strike, but with many small wounds, each one cutting deeper into the fabric of the wizarding world. At first, their acts of violence were hidden beneath shadows, whispered about in markets and taverns, dismissed by some as rumor. But as the years passed, the whispers grew into screams, and the world could no longer look away. Their first targets were often chosen carefully. Families that had spoken openly in defense of Muggle-borns, witches and wizards who opposed blood purity, ministry officials who refused to bend to Voldemort's influence. Some vanished without a trace, their homes left cold and silent. Others were found with the dark mark above their roofs, the skull and serpent glowing against the night, a message as clear as any written in ink. Each act spread fear wider, for it told the wizarding world that Voldemort's reach could touch anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Death Eaters mastered intimidation as much as they mastered curses. They threatened shopkeepers, extorted families, and demanded loyalty in exchange for safety. Those who resisted were punished swiftly. Entire households were burned to ash, leaving neighbors too frightened to ask questions. It was not only power they wanted, it was obedience, born of terror. Among their earliest acts of cruelty was the open use of the unforgivable curses. The imperious curse meant unwilling servants to their cause, turning ordinary witches and wizards into puppets who betrayed their friends without even knowing. The Cruciatus curse was used freely, reducing proud men and women to screams that echoed through villages, and the killing curse, swift and cold, became a signature of their raids. For centuries, these curses had been forbidden, but under Voldemort, they became common tools, proof that law no longer restrained those who followed him. The Ministry, slow to act, struggled to understand what was happening. Many inside its walls were already under Voldemort's sway, controlled by fear, bribery, or the imperious curse itself. Others simply refused to believe that a dark army was rising in their midst. This allowed the Death Eaters to grow bolder. What began as whispers in alleys soon became open attacks, and by the late 1960s, their presence could no longer be denied. The cruelty of the Death Eaters went beyond killing. They delighted in humiliation, turning brother against brother, forcing children to watch as their families suffered, raking minds as much as bodies. Some of the most feared names among them, like Bellatrix Lestrange and Antonin Dolohov, earned their reputations in these years, carrying out acts of violence so brutal that their victims were remembered for generations. The Lestranges in particular wore their loyalty like fire, worshipping Voldemort with a devotion that bordered on madness, delighting in every chance to serve his will. It was not only witches and wizards who suffered. Muggles too became targets, chosen not for what they had done, but for what they were. Families vanished from villages, their names erased, their homes left as ruins marked with the skull and serpent. To Voldemort and his followers, this was proof of dominance, a declaration that the Statute of Secrecy was no chain for them. Where others hid from Muggles, the Death Eaters struck them without hesitation, a warning to both worlds that Voldemort bowed to no law. These early years were also when the Dark Mark became a symbol not only of fear but of ritual. After every killing, the mark was cast into the sky, its green light staining the night, a beacon that told the world death had come. Children woke screaming at the sight. Parents whispered of fleeing their homes, and every witch and wizard knew that where the mark burned, Voldemort's hand had struck. For the Death Eaters, these acts were more than terror. They were training. Each raid tested their loyalty, hardened their resolve, and deepened their bond to Voldemort. Those who faltered were punished, their screams serving as warnings to others. Those who excelled were rewarded with his approval, a rare gift that bound them closer still. They did not simply serve him, they worshipped him, feared him, and sought his praise as though it were life itself. By the time the wizarding world fully understood the scale of the threat, it was too late to stop it quietly. Voldemort had gathered not only an army but a legend. His name was no longer spoken without shiver, his followers no longer dismissed as reckless youth. They were Death Eaters, and their rise had already begun to drown Britain in darkness. As the 1970s unfolded, Voldemort's movement shifted from secret raids and whispered curses into something larger, something that spread like fire through the highest halls of wizarding society. What had begun with small acts of terror now drew the attention of families whose names had been written in magical history for centuries. The Malfoys, the Lestranges, the Knots, the Averys, the Carrows, and others all found themselves standing beneath Voldemort's banner. Some came eagerly, some out of fear, but all wore the Dark Mark before the decade was done. Pure-blood families had long guarded their heritage, priding themselves on ancestry and tradition. Voldemort spoke to those old beliefs, sharpening them into weapons. He promised them that the future belonged to those who held the strongest bloodlines, that Muggle-borns and half-bloods would one day be cast aside, that the wizarding world would rise again in purity. To some, it was intoxicating. words they had long thought but never dared to shout aloud. To others, it was survival. Better, they thought, to kneel and live than to resist and die. Lucius Malfoy embodied the careful balance of ambition and self-preservation. With wealth, influence, and political ties, he offered Voldemort more than loyalty. He offered access to the highest levels of the ministry, to doors that might otherwise have stayed shut. He moved in social circles with elegance, masking cruelty behind charm, and served as one of Voldemort's most useful tools in the corridors of power. The Lestrangers, by contrast, were not cautious but fanatical. Bellatrix, Rodolphus, Rabastan served with devotion that bordered on worship. Bellatrix in particular delighted in Voldemort's every command, her laughter echoing through raids, her wand quick with the Cruciatus curse. She saw herself not only as a servant, but as a chosen hand of her master, and her name became a synonym for terror. Other families, like the Knotts, the Yaxleys, and the Carrows, followed as well, each adding to the growing circle. Some offered their influence, some their wealth, some their willingness to kill. Each was bound by the dark mark, seared into their skin, a constant reminder that loyalty to Voldemort was eternal. But the Death Eaters were not limited to the ancient families alone. Voldemort also gathered those who were ambitious, those who felt overlooked, those who saw in him a chance to rise above their station. Some came from half-blood backgrounds, and though Voldemort himself was half-blood, he never admitted it. To his followers he presented the mask of purity, and they believed it or chose to believe it, for he gave them power, and power was more important than truth. The Death Eaters grew not only in numbers but in reach. They infiltrated the Ministry of Magic, placing loyalists under the Imperius Curse or persuading ambitious officials to turn a blind eye. They spread influence into Hogwarts itself, encouraging students to think of blood purity, whispering that those who were not pure would never truly belong. Even the Daily Prophet began to feel their hand, articles softened or sharpened, according to the will of Voldemort's followers. With wealth and power behind them, their raids grew larger. Villages were attacked, not only for bloodlines, but to spread fear. Shops were destroyed, families abducted, and the Dark Mark burned above towns. It was no longer isolated killings. It was a campaign of terror that reached into every corner of Britain. Some wizards fled abroad, others hid in fear, but all felt the pressure of the Death Eaters' grip. Inside their gatherings, Voldemort reigned with iron certainty. He stood before his followers, his body already shifting from the handsome face of Tom Riddle into the pale, snake-like form that would define him. He spoke of destiny, of a world remade, of a future where wizards ruled openly over muggles. His voice was both soft and commanding, carrying weight that made even the proudest pureblood bow. The Death Eaters did not simply follow him. They feared him, they worshipped him, and they longed for his approval more than they feared death itself. By the end of the decade, Voldemort's circle was no longer a secret society hidden in shadows. It was an army, spread across Britain, its influence in every institution, its terror in every home. The pure-blood families had given him legitimacy, the ambitious had given him numbers, and together they formed a force that no witch or wizard could ignore. The Death Eaters had become more than followers. They were a movement, and their master was ready to declare war. By the mid-1970s, the whispers and raids of Voldemort's followers had grown into something larger than fear alone. The Ministry of Magic could no longer dismiss the disappearances and the dark marks burning over homes. The wizarding world entered an age that would be remembered as the First Wizarding War, a conflict that reshaped Britain, scarred families, and carved the Death Eaters into history. The opening of the war was not marked by a single declaration, but by a tide of violence that could no longer be contained. Attacks came almost weekly, each one striking deeper into the heart of society. Families vanished overnight. Shops in Diagon Alley were shattered by curses, and the Dark Mark became a common sight against the night sky. Muggleborns were the first targets, hunted not for what they had done, but for what they were. To Voldemort and his followers, they were symbols of everything impure, and their suffering was used to frighten others into silence. The Ministry of Magic struggled to respond. Many of its officials were under the Imperious Curse, their wills stolen by Death Eaters. Others were bribed or too fearful to act. Laws were passed and patrols increased. But Voldemort's influence was already woven into the very fabric of government. What should have been the strongest defense of Wizarding Britain was instead a house filled with cracks, and the Death Eaters pressed through every weakness. It was in this chaos that the Order of the Phoenix was born. Albus Dumbledore, already known as one of the greatest wizards of his time, gathered those willing to fight. They were not many, but they were brave, and their loyalty to each other matched the fanaticism of Voldemort's followers. The Order became the counter to the Death Eaters, clashing with them in villages, forests, and even within the Ministry itself. But the Death Eaters held the advantage of numbers and fear. They struck without warning, vanishing as quickly as they came, leaving bodies and broken walls behind. The killing curse was their weapon of choice, swift and silent, leaving no trace but lifeless eyes. The Cruciatus Curse filled homes with screams, leaving victims broken in body and spirit. And the Imperious Curse turned neighbor against neighbor, forcing betrayal without mercy. For the first time in centuries, the wizarding world knew what it meant to live in daily terror. Some of the Death Eaters gained reputations during these years that would last long after their deaths. Bellatrix Lestrange became infamous for her cruelty, delighting in torture, laughing as her victims fell. Antonin Dolohov was feared for his dueling skill, striking down enemies in open combat. The Carrows carried out raids with merciless efficiency, leaving trails of ruin. Each name became a curse, whispered by families huddled in fear. Proof that Voldemort's followers were not shadows but killers who walked openly among them. Even Hogwarts felt the weight of the war. Though the castle remained protected by ancient wards and Dumbledore's presence, the children of Death Eater families walked its halls. Rivalries between houses grew sharper. Trust between students faltered, and the Sorting Hat songs of unity became more desperate. Some students dreamed of joining Voldemort, believing his promises of power. Others feared even to speak his name. Though the castle itself was never breached, its spirit carried the strain of a world tearing itself apart. By the late 1970s, the war touched every family. Even those who tried to remain neutral found that neutrality was no shield. Voldemort demanded loyalty, and refusal was met with death. The wizarding world grew smaller with each act of violence, as if darkness itself were pressing in on all sides. Safe places became rare. Trust became fragile, and always the Dark Mark burned above the ruins, a reminder that the Death Eaters were everywhere. For Voldemort, the war was more than conquest. It was a stage upon which he declared his mastery over life and death. Each murder, each scream, each terrified whisper of his name fed the legend he was building, and for his followers, it was proof that their loyalty was rewarded, that their master was unstoppable. Thus the First Wizarding War began, not with a single battle, but with 1,000 small terrors, each one adding to a tide of fear that swept across Britain. And though the Order of the Phoenix fought bravely, the world knew that the Death Eaters were winning. As the First Wizarding War deepened, certain names among Voldemort's followers rose above the rest, etched into history for their cruelty, their cunning, or their loyalty. The Death Eaters were many, drawn from ancient families and desperate wizards alike, but a few became the very face of the terror that spread across Britain. Their deeds carried weight far beyond their own lives, for they became the hands and voices of the Dark Lord himself. Bellatrix Lestrange was the most infamous. Fiercely devoted, she served Voldemort not only with loyalty but with adoration that bordered on worship. Her laughter rang through raids, her wand quick to cast the Cruciatus curse, her delight in suffering unrestrained. She was fearless in battle, reckless in pursuit, and cruel in every breath. To the Death Eaters, she was a model of devotion. To the wizarding world, she was the face of madness. Her name became a whisper that silenced rooms, for wherever Bellatrix walked, pain followed. Lucius Malfoy carried himself with elegance and control, his polished cane and silken words masking the venom beneath. He brought wealth, influence, and access to the highest levels of the ministry. Unlike Bellatrix, Lucius did not serve with passion but with ambition. He saw in Voldemort a path to power, and though he cloaked himself in refinement, his loyalty was sealed by the dark mark on his arm. He was a master of manipulation, weaving lies and influence as effectively as curses. The Lestrange brothers, Rodolphus and Rabaston, followed Voldemort with a steadiness matched only by their sister-in-law Bellatrix. They were not as flamboyant, but their cruelty was no less deep. Alongside Bellatrix, they carried out raids that left families shattered, their names bound forever to the darkest deeds of the First War. Antonin Dolohov was known for his skill in dueling. His spells cut down members of the Order of the Phoenix in open battle, his curses swift and merciless. Where others relied on numbers, Dolohov's power alone was often enough to shift the tide of a fight. His name lingered in memories of blood on cobblestones and broken bodies left in alleys. The Carrows, Alecto and Aenicus, were siblings whose devotion to Voldemort came through cruelty to the weak. They struck fear into children, punished without hesitation, and found joy in using pain as lesson. Their methods, later seen more clearly during the Second War, already revealed themselves in the First. Other names, though less known, filled the ranks. Avery Knott, Mulciber, and Travers each played their roles, some clever, some brutal, all bound to their master. Each bore the dark mark, each answered the burn on their arm, each carried out orders without question. For some, it was ambition that tied them. For others, fear. For a few, belief in the purity of blood burned as hot as Voldemort's own rage. Yet it was not only men and women of pure blood who joined him. Some came from half-blood families eager to hide their own shame by enforcing cruelty upon others. Voldemort himself, though half-blood, never admitted it, and his followers did not question. His lies became their truth, and their silence became their loyalty. These figures formed the backbone of Voldemort's army. They carried out his vision, spread his fear, and ensured that his name grew larger than the man himself. To children, they were nightmares given flesh. To families, they were executioners. And to Voldemort, they were tools, each valuable until they faltered, each discarded when they failed. The strength of the Death Eaters lay not only in their numbers but in their faces. Bellatrix, Lucius, Dolohov, the Lestranges, the Carrows, and others became symbols of terror, their reputations spreading faster than fire. They were not shadows in masks alone. They were names carved into the memory of a generation, names that would echo even after the war ended. The First Wizarding War was no longer only Voldemort against the world. It was Voldemort and his chosen, each one wielding fear as both weapon and shield, and with each raid, each duel, each life destroyed, their place in history was written deeper, until the very mention of Death Eater meant more than an army. It meant these names, these faces, these hands of darkness. The Death Eaters did not rise through numbers alone, nor through whispers in corridors of power. What set them apart What froze the wizarding world in terror was their open embrace of dark magic and cruelty, where most wizards drew lines that must not be crossed. Voldemort and his followers stepped over them without hesitation. Their war was not only fought with spells, but with pain, with fear, and with the deliberate unmaking of the boundaries that had long kept wizardkind from descending into savagery. The unforgivable curses became their signature. The killing curse, a flash of green light, ended lives without mark or wound, leaving bodies still and eyes wide. For centuries it had been spoken of only in hushed tones, a curse forbidden and abhorred. The Death Eaters used it as casually as others might cast a stunning spell. The Cruciatus curse twisted bodies into screams, breaking spirits as much as flesh, and many victims were left forever changed, their minds fractured by pain. The Imperious curse bent wills, forcing mothers to harm their children, friends to betray each other, neighbors to carry out acts they would never have chosen. To Voldemort, these curses were not only weapons, they were tools to display his mastery over life, death, and freedom itself. But their cruelty extended beyond spells. The Death Eaters turned torture into performance, humiliation into ritual. They destroyed homes, not only to kill, but to erase. They forced families to watch one another suffer, breaking bonds as well as bodies. They burned symbols of Muggle life in fields, leaving corpses beside the ruins as warnings. To them, terror was not a side effect of war. It was the war itself. Some sought power through ritualistic magic, experimenting with curses and enchantments long thought lost. Voldemort encouraged such pursuits when they served him, though he never allowed others to reach power that might challenge his own. His Horcruxes were the deepest proof of this. Soul-splitting magic so foul that even the darkest wizards of history had recoiled, yet to his followers, they were whispers of immortality, proof that their master was not bound by death. The cruelty of the Death Eaters also lay in their joy. Bellatrix Lestrange's laughter during torture was infamous, but she was not alone. Many found a twisted pride in their ability to inspire fear. Some boasted of the screams they had caused, others of the families they had destroyed. Even among themselves, their loyalty was measured by the darkness of their deeds. To hesitate was weakness. To kill without mercy was strength. For the wizarding world, the horror was not only in the acts themselves, but in the knowledge that no place was safe. The dark mark in the sky could appear above any home. A knock at the door could mean a neighbor under Imperius. A sudden silence in a village could mean the Death Eaters had people learn to live in fear of the night, of the unknown, of their own shadows. The Ministry attempted resistance, sending Aurors to fight in duels that lit the sky. But the Death Eaters were ruthless. Many Aurors fell, and those who survived carried scars that never faded. Some, like Alastor Moody, became hardened, their bodies marked by curses, their minds sharpened by constant vigilance. Others broke, unable to face the endless cruelty, their wands set aside in despair. What Voldemort had built was not only an army, but a culture of fear. A circle in which cruelty was celebrated, where darkness was not hidden, but embraced. The Death Eaters thrived in that culture, feeding on pain, binding themselves to their master through acts so terrible that they believed no forgiveness could ever release them. By making them perpetrators of such horror, Voldemort ensured their loyalty. They could not return to ordinary lives. They could only go deeper into the shadow. And so the First Wizarding War darkened. The wizarding world had faced dark wizards before, but never an organized legion that turned cruelty itself into a banner. With every curse cast, every scream silenced, the Death Eaters became more than followers. They became symbols of a world where fear ruled, where mercy died, and where power was measured in the depth of suffering one could inflict. The First Wizarding War could not have lasted as long as it did without weakness in the very institution meant to defend the wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic, meant to be the shield of society, instead became riddled with cracks. Fear spread through its offices like smoke, and Voldemort's followers slipped through those cracks, infiltrating, corrupting, and bending the ministry until its strength was little more than illusion. Some of the infiltration came through the Imperious Curse. Officials once loyal began to act strangely. Policies shifted without explanation. Patrols were re-rated at crucial times. Raids against suspected Death Eaters collapsed in confusion. Entire departments seemed compromised. Their members forced to obey commands whispered into their minds by Voldemort's loyalists. These victims often did not even know what they had done until it was too late. Others willingly surrendered their integrity for promises of safety, wealth, or influence, quietly aiding the very movement they were sworn to fight. Fear was perhaps Voldemort's most effective weapon. Ministry workers were not warriors. They were clerks, judges, administrators, and mediators, and they lived with the knowledge that refusal to obey could mean the end of their families. Some accepted bribes, others closed their eyes to what they saw, but many simply hid, pretending that neutrality might shield them. But neutrality was no shield against Death Eaters. It was only an invitation for exploitation. Even the Auror office, though braver than most, suffered heavy losses. Those who remained lived under constant threat, their homes warded like fortresses, their lives reduced to endless watchfulness. Alastair Moody, the fiercest of them all, survived duel after duel, but carried the scars of curses and the loss of comrades. The Aurors fought valiantly, but they were few, and the Ministry gave them little support. Each battle they fought was against not only Voldemort's followers, but against the doubt of their own leaders. The Wizengamot, the body that judged magical law, became paralyzed. Trials collapsed because witnesses vanished. Evidence disappeared, or jurors were themselves under suspicion. Convictions were rare, and when Death Eaters stood accused, they escaped with claims of being under Imperius or with bribes delivered in silence. Families who had lost loved ones watched in despair as their tormentors walked free. The people saw the cracks widening and felt more certain with each passing month that the Ministry could not protect them. The Death Eaters understood the value of this infiltration. They struck not only with curses but with manipulation, ensuring that every institution of government carried their shadow. Diagon Alley shopkeepers whispered of Ministry inspectors who were really Death Eaters in disguise. Department heads avoided certain names on reports, afraid of who might be reading them. Even the Daily Prophet often printed softened versions of events, shaping the truth to avoid spreading panic, but in doing so, hiding the scale of Voldemort's rise. By the late 1970s, the Ministry had lost much of its authority. Villagers no longer trusted its patrols, families no longer believed its reassurances, and even Hogwarts looked less to the Ministry and more to Dumbledore for protection. For all its towers and departments, the Ministry had become hollow, a place where fear ruled more strongly than law. Voldemort knew this and used it. He did not need to destroy the Ministry outright. He only needed to hollow it out until it collapsed beneath its own weakness. His Death Eaters served as the termites in the beams, eating away at the foundation until the structure was nothing more than an empty shell. When the war reached its peak, the Ministry was already failing. It had not fallen to a single blow, but to 1,000 small infiltrations, each one deepening the cracks. For the wizarding world, this collapse was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Death in the night could be feared, but the idea that the government itself could not be trusted turned fear into despair. When the Ministry faltered, Families realized they stood alone, and in that isolation, the Death Eaters thrived. As Voldemort's influence spread and the Ministry stumbled under fear and corruption, a different kind of resistance began to form. It was not built on authority or law, nor on wealth or political ties. It was built on loyalty, bravery, and the will to fight even when victory seemed impossible. At its center stood Albus Dumbledore, who understood earlier than anyone else that the Ministry could not hold against Voldemort alone. Thus, in the shadows of the 1970s, the Order of the Phoenix was born. The Order was not large. It did not have the numbers of the Death Eaters, nor their control of government. What it had instead were men and women who refused to bow, who placed their lives in Dumbledore's hands because they trusted his wisdom and his strength. They were witches and wizards from many houses and many walks of life, bound not by marks on their arms, but by the knowledge that if Voldemort triumphed, the wizarding world would be lost to cruelty forever. The first members were names that would one day be spoken with reverence. James and Lily Potter, brilliant and brave, who fought not only with skill but with love for the world they wanted their son to inherit. Sirius Black, reckless and fierce, loyal to his friends until the end. Remus Lupin, calm and thoughtful, who carried the burden of his condition yet fought with tireless courage. Peter Pettigrew, small and timid, who followed where others led, though his loyalty would not endure. Frank and Alice Longbottom, auras of remarkable skill, their courage matched only by their kindness. Emmeline Vance, Dorcas Meadows, Marlene McKinnon, Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, each one a light in the dark, each one hunted by Death Eaters who sought to extinguish them. The Order did not meet in grand halls or open assemblies. They gathered in secret in safe houses cloaked with Fidelius charms, in back rooms lit by candlelight, in whispers carried by owls. Their work was dangerous, their missions desperate. They fought to protect Muggle-borns, to shield villages from raids, to defend Ministry officials still loyal to truth. They struck back at Death Eaters when they could, not with numbers, but with skill and unity. The battles between the Order and the Death Eaters were fierce and brutal. In hidden valleys, curses lit the night sky, green and red flashing against the dark. In forests, shadows clashed in silence, the outcome marked by who returned and who did not. In cities, homes became fortresses and streets became battlegrounds. The Order fought not for power, but for survival, not to conquer, but to preserve. Voldemort despised the Order for what it represented. It was not their strength that threatened him, for his army was larger. It was their refusal to bow, their willingness to fight even when defeat seemed certain. He called them traitors, blood traitors, fools who clung to weak. Yet in truth, he feared them, for their defiance weakened the terror he sought to spread. If even a few dared to resist, others might find courage as well. The Order's work came at a terrible cost. Members were hunted relentlessly. Some were murdered in their homes, others ambushed in battle. Families of members were threatened or destroyed. Children grew up without parents, siblings without brothers or sisters. Yet the Order endured, each loss only deepening the resolve of those who remained. Hogwarts, though not the Order's base, became a quiet part of its strength. Dumbledore himself remained headmaster, his presence at the school both shield and inspiration. Students whispered of his secret work, never knowing the full truth, but sensing that their headmaster was fighting a war as surely as their parents. Professors like McGonagall and Flitwick offered what support they could, though the walls of the castle had to remain a place of learning even in times of war. The rise of the Order of the Phoenix was a turning point in the First Wizarding War. For the first time, Voldemort's followers faced not only scattered resistance, but a united front. small yet unbreakable. The Order could not match the Death Eaters in numbers, but it matched them in spirit. And in the long nights of the war, when fear threatened to smother hope, it was the Order's quiet flame that kept the wizarding world from falling entirely into shadow. As the First Wizarding War reached its height, the attacks of the Death Eaters grew bolder and bloodier. No longer content with whispers and isolated murders, they began to strike openly, spreading terror not only through fear, but through spectacle. Each attack carried a message, each dark mark in the sky a declaration that Voldemort's power reached everywhere. The wizarding world lived in constant dread, for there was no pattern, no safe place, only the certainty that the Death Eaters would come again. One of the earliest and most infamous assaults was on the Bones family. Edgar Bones, a member of the Order of the Phoenix and a man of great courage, was killed along with much of his family. The dark mark burned above their home, and the news spread swiftly, sending a wave of despair across the wizarding community. The loss of the Bones family struck deeply, for it showed that not even the bravest defenders could stand against Voldemort's fury. The McKinnons suffered a similar fate. Marlene McKinnon, remembered as bright and fierce, and her family was slaughtered in one of Voldemort's purges. Those who knew her in the Order spoke of her laughter and her fire, and their grief only deepened the resolve of her comrades. But to the world, it was another reminder that Voldemort did not forgive defiance, and that whole bloodlines could be erased in a single night. The Prewett brothers, Gideon and Fabian, also fell during this time. Known for their strength and determination, they fought bravely against overwhelming odds, but the Death Eaters cut them down. Their deaths echoed through the Order, for they had been symbols of resilience, and their loss showed how high the cost of resistance had become. Raids were not limited to wizards alone. Muggle villages were attacked in secrecy, their families destroyed, their homes left in ruins, with only the green glow of the dark mark to mark what had happened. To Voldemort and his followers, these attacks were not only acts of cruelty, but demonstrations of power, reminders that the Statute of Secrecy was a cage he did not intend to obey. Muggles vanished without explanation, their fates whispered only in the darkest corners of magical Britain. The Death Eaters also struck at institutions. Attacks on ministry officials became common, offices sabotaged, records destroyed, even Diagon Alley was not spared. Shops were raided, owners killed or forced into silence. Families avoided the street after dark, and even in daylight, the once vibrant hub of magical trade felt subdued. Its laughter dimmed, its windows shuttered. Perhaps the most terrible of all their cruelties was the use of the Cruciatus curse, not only to torture but to break minds. Frank and Alice Longbottom, auras of great skill and loyalty to the Order, were captured by Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus, her brother-in-law Rabaston, and Barty Crouch Jr. They were tortured until their minds shattered, leaving them broken, their bodies alive but their spirits gone. The attack came after Voldemort's fall, but it was rooted in the same cruelty that marked every Death Eater assault. It stood as the clearest example of how far they were willing to go in their devotion, and it left scars on the wizarding world that never healed. Every attack served Voldemort's purpose. Each raid silenced opposition, each murder removed a threat, each act of cruelty deepened the fear that bound society into obedience. The wizarding world began to shrink into silence, neighbors afraid to speak aloud, families too frightened to leave their homes, trust dissolved. Anyone might be under Imperius, anyone might be marked. For the Order of the Phoenix, these attacks were both battle and loss. They fought where they could, saved who they could, but the Death Eaters outnumbered them, and victory was rare. Each success carried heavy cost, and each loss was a reminder that the war was tilted toward darkness. Yet still they fought, refusing to yield, refusing to let Voldemort's terror drown the last lights of resistance. By the final years of the 1970s, the wizarding world was weary. The Ministry faltered, the Order was thinned, and the Death Eaters seemed unstoppable. Voldemort's name was spoken only in whispers, if at all, and even among the brave there was despair. But the tide of history was already shifting, for prophecy had been spoken, and destiny was about to turn its gaze upon a child. By the early 1980s, Voldemort's hold on the wizarding world seemed nearly complete. The Ministry was weakened. The Order of the Phoenix suffered loss after loss, and the Death Eaters moved through villages and cities like hunters through a forest. Yet at the very height of his power, a single prophecy began to turn the tide. It spoke of a child who would be born at the end of July, a child with the power to defeat the Dark Lord. That prophecy, carried from the lips of Sybil Trelawney to the ears of Albus Dumbledore, became the thread upon which Voldemort's fate would unravel. Severus Snape, still a young Death Eater at the time, overheard part of the prophecy and carried it to Voldemort. It was enough to convince him that his end might come at the hands of a child. Two boys fit the description: Neville Longbottom and Harry Potter. Voldemort chose Harry, perhaps because, like himself, the boy was half-blood, born of magical and muggle parentage. In that child he saw both threat and reflection, and he resolved to destroy him before the prophecy could be fulfilled. The Death Eaters watched as their master moved with singular purpose. His raids, his battles, his conquests were all shadowed by his obsession with one small boy. Some believed it madness. Others saw it as ruthless logic. To Voldemort, the prophecy was not a warning, but a challenge, and he would answer it with blood. The Potters went into hiding, shielded by the Fidelius charm, with their friend Peter Pettigrew as secret keeper. Unknown to them, Pettigrew had already bent beneath the weight of fear and chosen betrayal. On that fateful night in 1981, he delivered the secret to Voldemort, and the Dark Lord descended upon Godric's Hollow. The Death Eaters did not march with him that night. This was his task alone, the culmination of prophecy and pride. He entered the small home, slew James Potter as he tried to defend his wife and child, and then turned his wand upon Lily. She stood between Voldemort and her son, refusing to move. Her sacrifice bound a protection older than any curse, a shield woven by love itself. When Voldemort cast the killing curse upon the infant, it rebounded, destroying his body, shattering his soul, and leaving only a fragment of life behind. The fall of Voldemort was not the end of the Death Eaters, but it was the breaking of their power. Without their master, many scattered, some captured, some claiming they had been forced under Imperius. The Ministry, eager to restore its strength, arrested those it could and sent them to Azkaban. Trials filled the Wizengamot, and names once whispered in fear were shouted in chains before judges. Some escaped, hiding in shadows, waiting for a master who was no longer there. The wizarding world erupted in celebration. The boy who lived became legend overnight, his scar a mark of survival, his name a symbol of hope for families who had lost everything. His survival felt like a miracle. For the Order of the Phoenix, weary and broken, it was a victory purchased at unimaginable cost. For the Death Eaters, it was a ruin they had not imagined, the collapse of a world they believed was already theirs. The fall of Voldemort marked the end of the First Wizarding War, but it did not erase the shadow of the Death Eaters. Some, like Bellatrix Lestrange and her kin, remained fiercely loyal, believing their master would return. Others, like Lucius Malfoy, slipped back into society, claiming innocence, their wealth and influence protecting them from punishment. The mark upon their arms remained, faded but not gone, a reminder that their bond was not truly broken. For Voldemort, though stripped of body, was not destroyed. The Horcruxes he had created held fragments of his soul tethered to the world. He lingered, weak, formless, but alive. The prophecy had not ended. It had only begun. And though the wizarding world celebrated, the Death Eaters who remained whispered still, waiting for the day when their master would rise again. The fall of Voldemort in 1981 was like the sudden breaking of a storm. For years, the wizarding world had lived in darkness, the Death Eaters striking at will, the Ministry paralyzed, the Order of the Phoenix outnumbered. Then, in a single night, the Dark Lord was gone, defeated not by armies or auras, but by the sacrifice of one mother and the survival of her child. The relief was so deep, it shook Britain to its core. Yet when the cheering faded and the celebrations dimmed, the aftermath revealed scars that would take decades to heal. The Ministry, eager to reclaim its authority, moved quickly to capture and punish those who had served Voldemort. Auras scoured villages and towns, arresting known Death Eaters and dragging them before the Wizengamot. Some were taken openly, caught in the act of fleeing, or found hiding in safe houses abandoned in their master's fall. Others surrendered, throwing themselves upon the mercy of the courts. Azkaban filled swiftly. The Lestrangers, Bellatrix and her husband Rodolphus, along with Rabastan, were tried and sentenced, their defiance burning bright even as chains bound them. In the courtroom, Bellatrix's laughter echoed, declaring proudly that the Dark Lord would rise again, that his loyal would be rewarded. She was dragged away to the prison fortress, where Dementors drained joy from every stone. Yet even there, her fanaticism did not fade. Antonin Dolohov, Mulciber, Travers, and others were also condemned, their names listed in public as proof that justice had returned. To the wizarding world, their imprisonment seemed to mark the end of fear, the sealing away of nightmares behind the icy walls of Azkaban. Yet, not all Death Eaters faced justice. Many claimed that they had been under the Imperious curse, forced into service against their will. The courts, desperate to close wounds and restore stability, accepted these claims far more often than truth allowed. Lucius Malfoy stood among those who walked free, his wealth and influence ensuring that his excuses were accepted. He returned to his manor, his name restored, his mask of respectability intact. Others too slipped back into society, hiding the dark marks on their arms beneath sleeves and silence, rebuilding their lives while pretending innocence. Some Death Eaters vanished entirely, fleeing abroad, disappearing into forests or mountains where no aura dared search. The wizarding world spoke of them in whispers, wondering whether they had abandoned their master or whether they still waited for his return. For the families who had suffered, the aftermath was bitter. Trials and punishments could not restore the dead. The scars of torture did not fade, and the children who had lost parents grew into a world that could not give them back. The Longbottoms remained alive but broken, their minds shattered beyond healing. The Order of the Phoenix, though victorious, was diminished, many of its members gone, and yet for most, the relief outweighed the sorrow. The dark mark was no longer seen in the sky. The nights were no longer filled with screams, and Voldemort's name was spoken at last without a shiver. The boy who lived became a symbol of triumph, and his survival seemed to promise that the darkness had truly ended. But the Death Eaters were not gone. The mark still burned faintly on their arms, a bond not broken, only silenced. In Azkaban, the Lestrangers whispered of their master's return, their fanaticism feeding one another in the cold. In manors and villages, others hid their loyalty behind smiles, teaching their children the same beliefs, preparing for a day they believed would come. The aftermath of the First Wizarding War was a strange season of both peace and denial. The wizarding world longed to believe that Voldemort was finished, that his followers had been defeated, that the fear would never return. But shadows do not vanish so easily, and the scars left behind by the Death Eaters were proof enough that the war was not truly over. The wizarding world slept, but the shadow still lingered, waiting for its master's return. The years that followed Voldemort's fall were quieter than those that had come before, yet the silence was uneasy. The wizarding world wanted peace, and in many ways it found it. The dark mark no longer burned above homes, raids ended, and for the first time in a decade, children grew up without the constant threat of war. Yet the presence of the Death Eaters had not vanished. Their master was gone, but the marks on their arms still lingered, faint but not forgotten, and the ideology that had bound them did not die with Voldemort. Azkaban became the graveyard of their movement. Many of the most notorious Death Eaters were locked behind its walls, their souls drained daily by Dementors, their bodies wasting in the cold. Bellatrix Lestrange, her laughter silenced, remained defiant even there, whispering in the darkness of her master's inevitable return. The Lestrange brothers sat beside her in chains, their fanaticism undimmed. Dolohov, Travers, and others counted their years in silence, dreaming of freedom they believed would one day come. But beyond Azkaban, others lived free. Lucius Malfoy returned to his manor, cloaked in respectability, his wealth and connections shielding him from justice. He claimed to have been under Imperius, and though many doubted, few dared to challenge him. His influence returned quickly, his name restored, his voice once more carrying weight in the ministry. To the world he was a reformed man. But behind the walls of Malfoy Manor, the ideology of blood purity remained alive, taught to his son as truth. Other families followed the same path. They buried their past in silence, swore loyalty to peace, yet whispered in drawing rooms of the days when Voldemort's word was law. They told their children stories of power, of purity, of destiny, shaping a generation that would carry the seeds of the past into the future. Though Voldemort was gone, the soil he had cultivated was not barren. It waited quietly for his return. For the wider world, the years without Voldemort were marked by both relief and denial. The Ministry rebuilt its authority, eager to prove that it had regained strength. Trials were closed, Azkaban filled, and newspapers proclaimed victory. The wizarding world wanted to believe the darkness was gone, and so it turned away from the shadows, still lingering. Those who whispered of Voldemort's survival were dismissed as mad. The boy who lived was celebrated each year on the anniversary of his triumph, and the scars of war were pushed into memory. But beneath the calm, cracks remained. The victims of the war carried pain that could not be erased. The long bottoms, broken by the Cruciatus curse, remained in Sid Mungo's, their lives stolen, though their bodies still breathed. Families who had lost loved ones never forgot, their grief carried into each new day. The Order of the Phoenix disbanded, its members returning to lives forever changed. Dumbledore alone kept watch, suspecting that Voldemort was not truly gone, that the Horcruxes he had created tethered him still to the world. The Death Eaters themselves lived in uneasy half-lives. Some denied their pasts, others clung to their loyalty in silence. They gathered in small circles, drinking in private, whispering the name of their master like a prayer. They were scattered, leaderless, but not broken. The dark mark still lay dormant beneath their skin, a constant reminder that they belonged to him, that they would return if ever he called. For nearly 14 years, the wizarding world lived in this uneasy peace. Children grew up without knowledge of the terror their parents had endured. Hogwarts thrived again, laughter filling its halls, Quidditch roaring across the pitch, feasts glowing beneath the enchanted ceiling. To the new generation, the Death Eaters were little more than stories, warnings of a time gone by. To the survivors, They were scars that could not be forgotten. And in the forests of Albania, in shadows where few dared to walk, Voldemort lingered, a spirit without body, sustained only by hatred, feeding on snakes and whispering of revenge. His followers did not know where he was, but they believed, they waited, and when the day came that he would rise again, they would answer his call. The silence of the years without Voldemort was not peace, it was pause. For more than a decade, the Death Eaters had lived scattered and silent, their master gone, their mark faded but not erased. Some had buried their pasts beneath wealth and excuses, hiding behind claims of Imperius. Others sat in Azkaban, drained daily by Dementors, yet still whispering in the cold that their master would rise again. And far away, in the forests of Albania, Voldemort lingered, a shadow without form, clinging to life through the fragments of his soul. The wizarding world believed the terror was over. It was not. The first tremors of his return came not with armies, but with whispers. Harry Potter, now a student at Hogwarts, began to sense his presence. Strange dreams, visions of pain, shadows too sharp to be chance. Few believed him, and fewer still wished to. The Ministry insisted that Voldemort was gone forever, eager to preserve the fragile peace. Yet in secret, his servants still waited, their arms itching with the faint shadow of the mark, their loyalty bound by memory. It was in 1995, during the Triwizard Tournament, that the silence broke. Harry was forced into the tournament, bound by magic, though he had not entered his name. The tasks tested him beyond reason, but the true test was waiting at the end. The Triwizard Cup, which should have been the prize of victory, was a portkey twisted into a trap. When Harry and Cedric Diggory touched it together, they were torn from the maze and hurled into a graveyard. There, surrounded by Death Eaters who had gathered in the shadows, Voldemort rose again. His ritual, dark and foul, restored his body using bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. The pale figure of Tom Riddle was gone. In his place stood the Dark Lord reborn, snake-faced, red-eyed, more terrible than ever. His voice carried over the graveyard, commanding his followers back to him. The Death Eaters answered, one by one. They appeared, summoned by the burning in their arms. Some who had lived in hiding knelt eagerly, their loyalty undimmed by years of silence. Others who had claimed innocence, who had lived as respected members of society, now revealed their true allegiance. They bowed low, begging forgiveness for failing him, promising that they had never truly left. Voldemort accepted their devotion, but his punishments were cruel. Cowards who had denied him were tortured, their screams a reminder that loyalty must be proven in pain. For the Death Eaters, that night was a rebirth, as much as it was for their master. Their mark burned fresh and strong, their ranks renewed. No longer were they scattered shadows, they were once again an army. The wizarding world had celebrated too soon, and now it would face the terror once more. Harry escaped that graveyard, carrying Cedric's lifeless body, his scar burning with the truth of Voldemort's return. Yet, when he warned the Ministry, they turned away. Cornelius Fudge denied the truth, refusing to admit that Voldemort had risen again, and in that denial, the Dark Lord found his greatest advantage. While the wizarding world argued, while newspapers mocked Harry as delusional, Voldemort and his Death Eaters grew stronger in silence. The return of Voldemort was not greeted with armies marching in daylight, but with careful preparation. His followers returned to their places in society, acting as spies and saboteurs. His most loyal, like Bellatrix Lestrange, still rotted in Azkaban, but he promised they would be freed. Lucius Malfoy stood once more at his side, offering wealth and influence. Others, eager to prove themselves, sought to erase the shame of years spent hiding. The Death Eaters had waited 14 years for this moment. Now their master walked again, and they would serve him with renewed devotion. The graveyard became legend, the night when the Dark Lord returned, and the wizarding world, blind in its denial, slept while the storm gathered once more. The silence of peace was over. The Second Wizarding War had begun. After Voldemort's return in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, the Death Eaters moved with patience, building strength while the Ministry closed its eyes. Denial gave them time, and time gave them power. For a year, the wizarding world argued whether Harry Potter's words were true, while Voldemort and his followers quietly gathered allies, rebuilt their ranks, and prepared for open war. The first sign of their renewed strength came with the breakout from Azkaban in 1996. The Dementors, once feared jailers, had turned their loyalty to Voldemort. Drawn by the promise of greater feasts than the Ministry ever allowed, they opened the prison's gates, and the most loyal Death Eaters walked free. Bellatrix Lestrange, gaunt but unbroken, stepped out with laughter on her lips, her devotion stronger than before. Alongside her came the Lestrange brothers, Dolohov, Rookwood, and others, their return swelling Voldemort's inner circle. The wizarding world reeled at the news, but still the Ministry hesitated, clinging to denial. With his most loyal servants restored, Voldemort began striking again. Attacks on Muggleborns increased, shops in Diagon Alley were destroyed, families vanished. Yet the Death Eaters no longer sought only to terrify. They sought to infiltrate and control. Lucius Malfoy and others used their influence to bend laws, spread propaganda, and weaken opposition. Each act was designed to hollow out resistance, leaving the Ministry vulnerable to collapse. Hogwarts, too, felt the shadow. Though Dumbledore remained headmaster, and the castle's wards kept it safe, whispers spread among the students. Some admired Voldemort's return in secret, repeating their parents' words about blood and power. Others trembled, remembering the scars of the Chamber of Secrets, fearing that history was repeating itself. The Sorting Hat warned again of division, urging unity, but its words fell into a world already splitting apart. The Order of the Phoenix reformed in answer. Dumbledore gathered the old members once more, calling Sirius, Remus, Moody, and others back into the fight. New members joined as well, younger witches and wizards determined not to let Voldemort rise unchecked. They met in secret at number 12, Grimmauld Place, the old Black family home, hidden by charms. While the Ministry turned away, the Order became the true shield of the wizarding world, striking against Death Eaters in the dark, protecting those most vulnerable. The battles of this new war were more direct, more desperate. Death Eaters clashed with the Order in the Department of Mysteries, where the prophecy that bound Harry and Voldemort was stored. The duel ended in tragedy, Sirius Black falling through the veil, his laughter silenced forever. The Ministry, forced at last to see what it had denied, could no longer hide the truth. Voldemort had returned, and the Death Eaters walked openly once more. From that moment, the war spread quickly. The Death Eaters grew bold, striking at Muggleborns, raiding wizarding villages, and even daring attacks in the heart of London. The sky burned with dark marks once again, as if the years of silence had never been. The Ministry was shaken, its power eroded, and families once more whispered of fleeing abroad. Voldemort himself remained in shadow, letting his followers carry out his will, yet his presence was felt everywhere, in the fear that spread like sickness, in the hesitation of the Ministry, in the scars left by each raid. The Death Eaters had become more than raiders. They were an organized army, armed with influence, wealth, and cruelty, ready to wage war until their master's vision of domination was realized. The Second Wizarding War had begun in earnest. And for the wizarding world, the terror of the past had returned, sharper and darker than before. By 1997, the war that had begun in whispers now thundered openly across the wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic, which had clung desperately to order, collapsed under the weight of betrayal and infiltration. The Death Eaters, once hidden in masks and secrecy, stepped fully into power, placing themselves in every office, every law, every judgment. What had been the seat of magical authority became a tool of Voldemort's will, and the wizarding world bent beneath their control. The fall of the Ministry came swiftly. Rufus Scrimgeour, who had tried to steady the government, was captured and killed, his defiance silenced before he could rally strength. In his place, Pius Thickness was installed as minister, his mind bent by the Imperious curse. From that moment, the Ministry's orders were no longer its own. They were Voldemort's. The first laws passed under Death Eater control revealed their true intent. A Muggle-born registration commission was created, forcing those born to non-magical parents to appear before inquisitors. They were accused of stealing magic, stripped of their wands, and sent to Azkaban, or worse. Families were torn apart, children left alone, and fear deepened. Pureblood families, once influential but cautious, now stood proudly with the regime, their wealth and loyalty rewarded with power. Those who resisted vanished, their names struck from records as if they had never lived. Daily life became a shadow of itself. Posters of the new order lined the walls, proclamations shouted from enchanted pamphlets. Aurors who resisted were replaced by Death Eaters in uniform, their badges no longer symbols of justice but of oppression. The Wizengamot, once the body of magical law, now passed judgments written by Voldemort's hand. Trials were no longer trials, but performances, with verdicts decided before a word was spoken. Diagon Alley, once vibrant with shops and laughter, dimmed under this new rule. Ollivanders was emptied, the Wandmaker taken captive to serve Voldemort's purposes. Flourish and blots, filled with propaganda, Weasley's Wizard Wheeze remained a spark of rebellion. But even there the shadow of fear lingered. Knockturn Alley flourished, its darkness now protected rather than hidden. The Death Eaters did not rule only through laws, they ruled through terror. The Dark Mark once again burned over homes, raids struck villages, and families who dared to speak Voldemort's name in defiance were silenced. Muggleborns lived in hiding, hunted by snatchers who prowled roads and fields, dragging the fearful into custody for coin. The very air of Britain seemed colder, the streets emptier, as if life itself recoiled from the presence of tyranny. Within Hogwarts, the shadow fell heavier than ever. Dumbledore was dead, struck down on the astronomy tower, and with him the last shield of the school's innocence was gone. Severus Snape was named headmaster, though his role was far more complex than most realized. The Carrow siblings, cruel and merciless, became professors, their lessons filled with pain. Children were forced to practice curses on one another, beaten for disobedience, punished for defiance. The school, once a sanctuary, became a prison. Yet even there, resistance burned quietly, with Neville Longbottom, Ginny Weasley, and Luna Lovegood reviving the spirit of Dumbledore's army in secret chambers. For the Death Eaters, this was triumph. They had not only regained the power they lost after Voldemort's first fall, they had surpassed it. They ruled openly, their cruelty written into law, their influence unquestioned. Voldemort himself moved in the shadows still, seeking the final Horcruxes and the Elder Wand, but his followers basked in the glory of their master's empire. And yet, even in their victory, cracks began to show. Some followed Voldemort out of fanatic devotion, like Bellatrix Lestrange, whose loyalty burned hotter than ever. Others, like the Malfoys, found themselves faltering, their ambitions souring into fear as the reality of Voldemort's rule consumed their lives. What had once seemed triumph became survival, and the loyalty of some Death Eaters began to tremble beneath the weight of their master's demands. The fall of the Ministry marked the darkest moment of the Second Wizarding War. For a year, the Wizarding world lived beneath the rule of Death Eaters, their cruelty woven into daily life, their oppression choking hope. But history was already moving toward its final clash, for the castle that had stood for centuries would once again become the battlefield where darkness and light would meet. With the fall of the Ministry, Hogwarts itself was dragged fully into Voldemort's grip. The castle that had once stood as a sanctuary for generations of young witches and wizards became a place of fear, twisted into something it had never been. The headmaster's office, once warmed by Dumbledore's presence, now belonged to Severus Snape. His appointment was a mask for the truth, for though he sat in the chair, the school was ruled in practice by the Carrow siblings, Alecto and Amycus, cruel enforcers of Voldemort's will. The Carrows transformed lessons into punishments. Defense against the dark arts was no longer taught as defense at all. Instead, students were instructed in the use of dark curses, encouraged to practice cruelty on one another. The unforgivable curses, once forbidden even in name, were now demanded of children barely old enough to hold a wand. Those who resisted were beaten, hexed, or forced to watch their classmates suffer. Even younger students, who should have been learning charms and transfiguration, lived in constant dread of being called forward as targets for humiliation. Detention, once a nuisance, became a terror. Amycus favored the Cruciatus curse, delighting in the screams of those too brave to bow their heads. Alecto used whips and hexes, leaving marks on the bodies of children, as if pain itself were a lesson. Students began to vanish into the dungeons, returning days later silent and broken, or sometimes not returning at all. The school that had once promised safety had become a place where survival meant silence. Yet even in this darkness, resistance lived. Neville Longbottom, once shy and uncertain, emerged as a leader within the castle. Alongside Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood, he revived Dumbledore's army, gathering students in the Room of Requirement, which transformed itself into a hidden sanctuary. There, the spirit of rebellion was kept alive. Students practiced defensive spells, whispered words of encouragement, and found strength in unity. For many, the room became not only refuge but home, its walls providing warmth when the rest of the castle had turned cold. The ghosts of Hogwarts drifted uneasily, their pale forms watching cruelty with sorrow. Even Peeves, the poltergeist who had long thrived on mischief, turned his tricks against the Carrows when he could, though always from the shadows. The Sorting Hat, though silent most of the year, seemed heavier when touched, its fabric weighed down with the strain of division. The castle itself felt wounded, its magic dimmer, its walls echoing not with laughter but with fear. Snape's role as headmaster was complex. To most, he appeared as Voldemort's loyal servant, overseeing punishments, turning a blind eye to the Carrows' brutality. Yet beneath the surface, unseen by most, he acted in ways that preserved life when he could. He kept certain punishments lighter than ordered, turned his gaze at key moments, and passed on secrets to those who would one day fight. Few students saw this, and many hated him, but his presence, grim though it seemed, was one of the few shields left to the school. Hogwarts in those years became a reflection of the wider world. The Death Eaters ruled openly, their cruelty carved into daily life, their beliefs forced upon even the youngest children. Yet the spirit of resistance endured, carried in whispered lessons, in defiant glances, in small acts of rebellion. For every curse cast in cruelty, there was a shield raised in secret. For every scream in the dungeons, there was a song whispered in the room of requirement. The Death Eaters had claimed the school, but they had not claimed its heart. And when the final battle came, it would be those children, those teachers, and those rebels who stood to prove that Hogwarts could never truly belong to darkness. As Voldemort's power stretched over Britain, the Death Eaters no longer hid in shadows. They moved openly, dueling in streets, raiding villages, striking at wizarding families, and hunting Muggleborns with ruthless efficiency. The Order of the Phoenix, reborn in the fires of resistance, clashed with them again and again. These battles were desperate, often hidden from the public, but their cost was written in the names of the fallen. The battle at the Department of Mysteries had already shown how deadly the Death Eaters had become. When Lucius Malfoy led a group into the halls of the Ministry to seize the prophecy, the duel that followed revealed the strength and cruelty of Voldemort's most loyal. Though they failed to capture the prophecy intact, the Order suffered deeply. Sirius Black fell through the veil, and with him Harry Potter lost the godfather he had only just begun to know. The Death Eaters, though bloodied, returned to their master with proof that their reach had grown bold enough to strike at the very heart of magical authority. The following year brought the Battle of the Astronomy Tower. Death Eaters, led into the castle by Draco Malfoy's vanishing cabinet, fought within the very walls of Hogwarts. Curses lit the night sky above the grounds, students cowered in dormitories, and professors defended their school against masked invaders. It ended with Severus Snape casting the fatal curse upon Dumbledore, the most powerful defender of the wizarding world. Though the truth of Snape's actions was more complex, to the world it was clear: the headmaster was dead, and the Death Eaters had struck a wound into Hogwarts itself. Beyond these great battles, smaller duels marked the landscape of the war. Families known for defiance were targeted, their homes burned, their lives ended. Members of the Order like Emmeline Vance, Ted Tonks, and many others were murdered, their names added to the long list of the fallen. Raids struck not only at wizards but at Muggles, leaving devastation hidden from the wider non-magical world, but remembered by those who witnessed it. The Death Eaters also spread their war across borders. Allies were sought in Europe, sympathizers recruited in secret. Giants and werewolves joined their cause, lured by promises of freedom and violence. Fenrir Greyback, a werewolf feared even among his own kind, fought alongside Death Eaters attacking children, reveling in the spread of fear. With such allies, the Death Eaters became more than wizards with masks. They became a coalition of creatures and men bound together by darkness. The Order, though brave, was outnumbered. Its members fought with valor, but carried the scars of constant loss. Moody was killed during the Battle of the Seven Potters, struck from the sky in a desperate mission to protect Harry. George Weasley lost an ear in the same night, proof of how thin survival could be. Each battle was fought with courage, but every victory seemed matched by tragedy. The Death Eaters, for their part, grew more confident with each success. Bellatrix Lestrange, freed from Azkaban, became a figure of dread in every raid, her laugh rising over the screams of her victims. Dolohov and Travers struck at will, their curses leaving ruin behind. The Carrows spread fear through Hogwarts, while others bent the Ministry into an iron cage. To many, it seemed inevitable that Voldemort's triumph was near, for his army appeared unstoppable. Yet cracks ran beneath the surface. Not all Death Eaters were as devoted as Bellatrix. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, found their loyalty poisoned by fear. When Voldemort demanded sacrifices too great, their wealth and influence had once given them pride, but now their master's wrath left them trembling in their own homes. Others began to doubt whether the Dark Lord valued them at all, for Voldemort punished failure with cruelty, showing no mercy even to his most faithful. Still, the war pressed on, and the Death Eaters carried it with relentless force. They fought not only with spells but with fear, ensuring that the wizarding world bent beneath their will. And as the months passed, the battles grew larger, more desperate, leading the world toward the moment when all would converge upon the castle that had stood for centuries as a symbol of resistance. The Death Eaters had spread their terror across Britain. Soon, they would throw themselves against the walls of Hogwarts once more, and the final reckoning would begin. Though the Death Eaters ruled Britain with terror and cruelty, their unity was never as strong as it seemed. Beneath the masks and the dark marks burned fear, jealousy, and doubt. Voldemort inspired loyalty, but it was loyalty born of terror, not love. He punished failure with merciless cruelty, and in doing so, he created an army where every member feared not only the enemy but their own master. Some of the earliest cracks appeared in the Malfoy family. Lucius Malfoy had once stood proudly at Voldemort's side, offering wealth, influence, and political power. But after the failure at the Department of Mysteries, when the prophecy was destroyed and Lucius was sent to Azkaban, his master's trust turned to scorn. Though he was freed after Voldemort's return, Lucius was diminished, his cane and silken robes no longer symbols of strength, but reminders of failure. At Malfoy Manor, he bent his head low, desperate to regain favor. But Voldemort's contempt never softened. Narcissa Malfoy, proud and cold, found her loyalty tested when her son Draco was given an impossible task to kill Dumbledore. Voldemort had no faith in the boy's success. The task was a punishment, a threat, a means to break the family further. Narcissa, unwilling to lose her son, sought aid in secret, turning to Severus Snape. In the shadows of her home, she swore him to an unbreakable vow, binding him to protect Draco, and if the boy faltered, to complete the task himself. Her choice was born not of loyalty to Voldemort, but of defiance hidden in fear. Severus Snape himself was a figure of constant suspicion. To Voldemort, he was useful, skilled in potions, trusted by Dumbledore, able to move between worlds. But many Death Eaters distrusted him, jealous of the closeness he seemed to hold with their master. Bellatrix in particular questioned him openly, challenging his loyalty, though she could not deny his usefulness. Snape's true allegiance lay elsewhere, but only he and Dumbledore knew the depth of his double life. Even among the more fanatical, doubt sometimes crept in. The Carrows, once proud to enforce cruelty at Hogwarts, grew uneasy when faced with the rising defiance of students. They saw that fear alone could not control the young, that rebellion burned brighter in the oppressed. Yet to hesitate meant punishment, and so they pressed on, their brutality sharpened by their own terror. Bellatrix Lestrange remained unshaken, her loyalty burning hotter than ever. She mocked those who faltered, sneered at Lucius's weakness, and declared herself the Dark Lord's most devoted. But even she carried fear, for Voldemort demanded perfection, and even the most devoted servant could find themselves punished for failure. To serve him was to live in constant dread, to measure every word, every glance, every action. The fractures within the Death Eaters did not weaken their power immediately. They still struck with force, still spread terror, still held the ministry in their grip. But beneath the surface, survival began to outweigh devotion. For some, loyalty to Voldemort was no longer about belief in his cause, but about fear of what would happen if they turned away. This quiet shift mattered. When the final battle came, and the tide turned against them, those cracks would widen. Some would flee, abandoning their master when victory no longer seemed certain. Others would hesitate in their devotion, their fear of death stronger than their fear of Voldemort's wrath. And a few, like Narcissa Malfoy, would choose family over their master, proving that even among the darkest, love could bend loyalty. The Death Eaters stood as a terrifying army, but theirs was a unity bound by fear. And fear, though powerful, is never unbreakable. Among all the families bound to Voldemort, none showed more clearly the tension between ambition and survival than the Malfoys. Once proud, polished, and influential, they entered the Second Wizarding War with confidence, believing their wealth and pure-blood name gave them a place of honor in the Dark Lord's circle. But as the war deepened, their loyalty was tested, their pride stripped, and their devotion replaced by desperation. Lucius Malfoy had stood high among the Death Eaters during Voldemort's first rise. His gold bought influence, his voice carried weight in the Ministry, and his loyalty was rewarded with status. After Voldemort's fall in 1981, Lucius escaped punishment by claiming the Imperius Curse, slipping back into respectability while secretly keeping the mark on his arm. But when Voldemort returned in 1995, the mask of respectability crumbled. Lucius returned to his master's side, eager to regain favor, but his failure soon marked him as weak. The loss at the Department of Mysteries cut deeply. Lucius had led the raid to capture the prophecy, but it was destroyed, and he was taken to Azkaban. Though freed by Voldemort's influence, his master's disappointment was clear. The proud Malfoy patriarch, once polished in silver and silk, now bowed low, desperate for forgiveness, his cane no longer a symbol of power, but of trembling submission. Narcissa Malfoy, who had once carried herself with cold elegance, saw her family crumbling under Voldemort's wrath. When Draco was given the task of killing Dumbledore, she understood it for what it was, a punishment, a death sentence meant to break the Malfoy name. For Voldemort did not trust Draco to succeed. He only wanted to see the boy fail and the family suffer. It was then that Narcissa made her choice. She sought Severus Snape in secret, begging him to protect her son. In that darkened room, she made the unbreakable vow, binding Snape's life to Draco's survival. Her act was not loyalty to Voldemort, but rebellion born of love, a mother's defiance hidden in shadow. Draco himself carried the burden of this impossible task. At 16, he was thrust into a world of murder and betrayal he was not ready to face. He walked the corridors of Hogwarts with pride on the surface, but inside fear weighed heavy. He worked on the Vanishing Cabinet, plotting a path for Death Eaters into the castle, but each step deepened his despair. When the night came and Dumbledore stood before him, wand lowered, Draco could not cast the curse. He hesitated, torn between pride and terror, and in that moment Snape stepped forward, fulfilling the vow. From then on, the Malfoys lived not in triumph, but in terror. Their home, Malfoy Manor, became a meeting place for Death Eaters, its halls filled with cruelty and screams. Voldemort himself used their dining table as a stage for executions, forcing the family to watch as he toyed with victims. Lucius, once confident, now shook with fear. Narcissa stood silent, her face pale, her eyes fixed on her son. Draco, no longer a boy, carried the scars of choices forced upon him. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, the Malfoys were broken. Their loyalty to Voldemort had been consumed by dread. When the battle reached its height, Narcissa made the choice that would define her family's survival. In the Forbidden Forest, when Voldemort ordered her to check whether Harry Potter lived, she saw that he still breathed. But instead of revealing the truth, she lied, whispering that he was dead, because she needed to return to the castle and find her son. Her love for Draco outweighed her loyalty to Voldemort, and in that act, the fate of the war was sealed. The Malfoys survived, not because of their devotion to Voldemort, but because in the end they turned away from him. Their struggle showed that fear can bind men to darkness, but love can break those chains. They entered the war as symbols of pride and power. They left it humbled, their wealth and status diminished, their name forever stained, but their family intact. The story of the Malfoys is the story of what it meant to be a Death Eater when ambition met reality. When loyalty to darkness was tested by love, it was not devotion, that saved them. It was defiance, hidden in the heart of a mother. If the Malfoys showed the cracks in Voldemort's army, Bellatrix Lestrange showed its burning heart. Among the Death Eaters, none matched her devotion, none carried her master's cause with such fire. Where others followed out of fear, ambition, or survival, Bellatrix followed out of worship. To her, Voldemort was not only leader, but destiny, and she gave herself to him with every word, every curse, every breath. Her cruelty was legendary even before Azkaban. In the First Wizarding War, she fought with reckless delight, her laughter echoing through jewels, her wand swift with the Cruciatius curse. She believed pain was proof of power, that screams were the truest music. When Voldemort fell, she did not plead imperious. She did not hide. Alongside her husband Rodolphus, her brother-in-law Rabastan, and young Barty Crouch Jr., she tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom until their minds broke. Captured at last, she went to trial unrepentant, her voice ringing in the court as she declared that her master would rise again, and she would be there when he did. Azkaban did not break her. Where others wasted into silence, Bellatrix thrived on her devotion. Dementors could drain joy, but they could not drain the fire of her fanaticism. She clung to her master's name, whispering it in the darkness, feeding her spirit on the certainty that he would return. 14 years passed. Yet when the prison doors opened during the Great Breakout of 1996, she emerged unchanged, her eyes wild, her loyalty burning hotter than before. From that moment, she became Voldemort's most trusted hand. Her devotion was absolute, her cruelty unmatched. She mocked other Death Eaters for their weakness, sneered at the Malfoys for their hesitation, and demanded greater loyalty from all. Her place at her master's side was both feared and envied. For Voldemort tolerated her passion even when it spilled into recklessness. To him she was valuable, not because she was wise, but because her faith in him was unwavering. Her violence scarred the Second Wizarding War. In the Department of Mysteries, she struck down members of the Order, her wand carving death into the air. It was her curse that ended Sirius Black, sending him through the veil, robbing Harry Potter of his godfather in a moment that burned grief into his heart. She laughed as she fought, her joy in destruction unmatched, her eyes alight with fanatic fire. Bellatrix's devotion only deepened as Voldemort grew more powerful. She stood proudly at his side when he seized control of the Ministry, when Hogwarts fell into shadow, when families bent beneath his will. To her, every victory was proof of his greatness, every order a gift. She demanded obedience from her fellow Death Eaters, and those who faltered felt her scorn. To Bellatrix, hesitation was betrayal, and she did not forgive it. Her fanaticism consumed her to the very end. At the Battle of Hogwarts, she fought with the same wild delight, cutting down opponents with curses and laughter. She dueled Hermione, Ginny, and Luna at once, her skill so sharp that even three together could not easily best her. Yet it was Molly Weasley, driven by a mother's love as fierce as Bellatrix's madness, who stood against her. Their duel was brief but blazing, and in the end Bellatrix fell, her laughter silenced, her devotion extinguished. Bellatrix Lestrange's life was the embodiment of Death Eater fanaticism. She served not for gain, not for safety, not even for power, but for love, twisted into worship. She gave her soul to Voldemort willingly, and in doing so she became the purest expression of what it meant to be a Death Eater. Her death marked not only the loss of Voldemort's fiercest warrior, but the end of an era of madness carried on laughter and fire. The Malfoys survived by turning away. Bellatrix perished because she never could. The year 1997 into 1998 was the darkest season the wizarding world had endured since Voldemort's first rise. With the Ministry fallen and Hogwarts under Death Eater rule, There remained almost no corner of Britain untouched by his shadow. Muggleborns lived in fear of capture, families whispered in silence, and even those who once claimed neutrality found that no refuge existed. For the Death Eaters, it was triumph, their banners hidden in lore, their cruelty written into daily life. Yet for those who suffered, it was a year of terror, where every dawn might bring another loss. Snatchers roamed the countryside, hunting the desperate and the hidden. These bounty hunters, many of them petty criminals, worked under the Death Eaters' command, dragging Muggleborns and fugitives to the Ministry for trial. The courts were mockeries of justice, overseen by Death Eater loyalists like Dolores Umbridge, who wielded her authority with sickly sweetness and merciless zeal. Families were torn apart, wands confiscated, names struck from records. In homes across Britain, the word Muggleborn became a sentence. Malfoy Manor became the center of Voldemort's council. Its elegant halls, once places of polished power, were transformed into chambers of cruelty. Death Eaters gathered there, kneeling at their master's feet, reporting on raids, begging for mercy when they failed. Voldemort's punishments were as swift as they were brutal. Lucius Malfoy, once proud, lived in trembling fear, his voice silenced, his head bowed. Bellatrix Lestrange thrived in these councils, her laughter filling the manor, her devotion earning her place at Voldemort's right hand. The Order of the Phoenix, fractured but unbroken, fought from the shadows. Grimmauld Place remained a hidden base, but much of their work turned to defense, protecting those who fled, guiding Muggleborns into hiding. They could not strike openly, for the Death Eaters controlled the Ministry and its auras. Instead, the Order's courage was carried quietly, in secret missions and whispered resistance. Hogwarts became a mirror of the wider world, its corridors filled with fear. The Carrows ruled with cruelty, punishing students for the smallest defiance, forcing children to practice dark curses on one another. Yet in the Room of Requirement, resistance thrived. Neville Longbottom, Ginny Weasley, and Luna Lovegood kept the spark of Dumbledore's army alive, teaching younger students how to defend themselves, protecting those most vulnerable, turning the hidden room into a sanctuary. To many, Hogwarts was no longer a school. It was a battlefield waiting for the final clash. The Death Eater's confidence grew as Voldemort pursued the Elder Wand. When he broke into Dumbledore's tomb and seized the wand, his followers believed the end was near. With such power, no enemy could stand. Their triumph seemed inevitable, their victory only days away. The wizarding world bent beneath them, its hope dimming with each passing night. Yet even in that final year of terror, the seeds of their downfall were sown. The Malfoys faltered, their loyalty consumed by fear for Draco's life. Doubt crept into the ranks of lesser Death Eaters, who served out of terror more than devotion. And beyond their sight, Harry Potter and his friends hunted Horcruxes, striking at the fragments of Voldemort's soul that bound him to life. The final year of terror was the high tide of the Death Eaters' power, the moment when their grip seemed unbreakable, when their cruelty touched every corner of the wizarding world. But tides turn, and even at their height, the waves of destiny were already pulling them back. The Battle of Hogwarts was coming, and with it, the reckoning for every act of fear, every curse, every life destroyed in their master's name. The final reckoning began in the spring of 1998, when Harry Potter returned to the castle that had shaped his life. For months he and his friends had hunted the Horcruxes, striking at the fragments of Voldemort's soul hidden in relics and objects. Each one destroyed weakened the Dark Lord, and though he did not yet know the full truth, he felt the drain of his power. When word reached him that Harry had come to Hogwarts, Voldemort gathered his army. The Death Eaters, giants, acromantulas and allies of darkness marched toward the school, ready to crush the last place of resistance. Inside the castle, The call to arms spread swiftly. Students who wished to fight remained. The Order of the Phoenix arrived, their members stepping through hidden passages and secret entrances, their faces set with grim determination. Professors stood tall, their wands raised, their loyalty to Hogwarts stronger than fear. The Room of Requirement, once a sanctuary, opened its doors to release Dumbledore's army, its students ready to fight beside their elders. The defenders prepared the castle as it had been prepared in ages past. Wards rose stronger than ever. Statues leapt from their pedestals, armor clanged to life, and enchantments sealed corridors. Teachers laid traps, walls shifted to block invaders, and spells laced every archway. The castle itself seemed alive, its magic awakened to defend its children. When Voldemort's army arrived, the night exploded in fire. The grounds shook beneath the feet of giants, and the forest poured forth creatures of nightmare. The first wave of Death Eaters struck the walls, their curses crashing against shields, their voices raised in fury. Green light lit the sky, red sparks answered, and the dark mark burned above the castle, not as warning but as challenge. Inside, duels erupted in every corridor. Professors fought beside students, their wands flashing, their spells striking true. McGonagall moved with fierce precision, transfiguring suits of armor into soldiers. Flitwick wove charms that scattered Death Eaters in bursts of light. Sprout unleashed enchanted plants that entangled and strangled. Even Trelawney hurled crystal balls from the towers, her throws cracking skulls in grim defiance. The Death Eaters fought with equal fury. Bellatrix Lestrange darted through the chaos like flame, her curses striking without mercy. The Carrows hissed orders, reveling in cruelty even in battle. Dolohov, Trevors, and countless others clashed with the defenders, their wands cutting through air heavy with spells. For them, this was the war they had waited for, the chance to see their master triumph before the eyes of all. The first hours of the battle were chaos. Walls shook, towers crumbled, and cries of pain echoed through the halls. Yet even as Death Eaters pressed forward, the defenders stood firm. Children barely of age fought beside seasoned auras, their courage born not of skill but of love for their home. Each corridor became a battleground, each staircase a stand, each classroom a fortress. Outside, the grounds burned. Giants swung clubs that smashed stone, werewolves tore through the night, and the forbidden forest seethed with movement. The defenders fought back with everything they had, driving beasts into retreat, striking Death Eaters with spells that left them lifeless on the grass. But the tide was relentless, and for every enemy struck down, another rose. At midnight, the castle itself groaned under the strain. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and the great hall filled with the wounded. Yet even there, in the chamber of feasts and laughter, the fight did not end. Healers worked beside duelists, children carried water to the fallen, and those who could still stand returned to the battle. The Death Eaters pressed harder, their confidence swelling with Voldemort's presence on the field. They believed victory was near, that the castle would fall before dawn. Yet the defenders fought on, their spirit unbroken, their courage undimmed. Hogwarts had always been more than stone, and in that night it became a living symbol of defiance. The battle had begun, but the end was still far away. The darkest hours lay ahead. The night deepened, and the battle raged on. Hogwarts, once a place of laughter and study, had become a fortress of fire and shadow. Every corridor echoed with shouts and curses. Every courtyard burned with the clash of spells. The Death Eaters pressed forward with savage force, yet the defenders stood firm, their courage shining brighter with every hour. The Great Hall became a chamber of both battle and grief. The wounded lay upon conjured cots, healers moving quickly between them, their wands glowing with spells of mending. Children brought water, cloth, and bandages, their faces pale but their hands steady. Parents fought outside while their sons and daughters carried hope inside, proof that the will to resist could not be broken. In the courtyards, the fighting grew fiercer. Giants swung their clubs, smashing stone into dust, while defenders scrambled to drive them back with spells that shook the ground. The Death Eaters struck from behind masks, their curses killing as swiftly as lightning. The Dark Mark burned above, its green skull leering down at the chaos below, a symbol meant to terrify, but one that only steeled the resolve of those who resisted. It was in those hours that the defenders' bravery shone brightest. Neville Longbottom, once shy and uncertain, led students through the chaos with steady courage. When the sword of Gryffindor appeared to him, gleaming in the firelight, he swung it with resolve, proving that true strength was born, not from pride, but from perseverance. His courage gave hope to others, reminding them that even in the darkest night, light could be found. The Death Eaters fought with desperation as much as cruelty. Bellatrix Lestrange moved like a shadow of fire, her curses cutting through duels, her laughter echoing above the screams. Dolohov struck with precision, his spells tearing through defenders with deadly skill. The Carrows reveled in torment, sneering as they cast curses at children, their cruelty undimmed even in chaos. Each Death Eater fought not only for victory but to please their master, knowing that failure would mean torment worse than death. The defenders gave no ground willingly. Professors McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout fought with unyielding strength, their spells a storm of light and sound. Kingsley Shacklebolt clashed with Death Eaters in duels that lit the air like lightning. Even house elves, led by Kreacher, joined the fray, armed with knives and fierce loyalty, their battle cries ringing through the halls, losses mounted on both sides. Fred Weasley fell in the explosion of a curse, his laughter silenced forever, his family shattered with grief even as they fought on. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, standing side by side, were struck down in the chaos, leaving their son an orphan before he could walk. Each loss cut deeply, yet each loss also hardened the resolve of those who remained. The tide of the battle turned when Neville struck down Nagini with the sword of Gryffindor. The great serpent, Voldemort's last Horcrux, fell lifeless, and with it the final tether of his soul was cut. Though few knew it in that moment, the fall of Nagini meant that Voldemort was mortal once more. The Death Eaters fought on, unaware that their master's immortality had ended, but the defenders felt a shift, a spark of hope that spread like fire through weary hearts. The fighting surged toward the Great Hall, the castle's last heart. Walls cracked, spells burst, and both sides clashed in the final frenzy of the war. The Death Eaters screamed their loyalty, the defenders cried their defiance, and the air shook with the fury of 1,000 spells. Hogwarts itself seemed to tremble, its stones holding the weight of centuries, its spirit straining beneath the storm. The final moments were drawing near. Voldemort stood ready, his rage burning hotter with each heartbeat. His followers gathered in their last push. The defenders, bloodied but unbroken, prepared themselves for the end. The dawn was close, and with it would come the decision of the war. The dawn came gray and cold, and with it the final clash. The Great Hall, once a place of feasts and laughter, had become the stage for the end of a war. The wounded lay in silence along the walls. The living stood in weary defiance. And at the center, Voldemort faced Harry Potter. Around him, Death Eaters and defenders held their breath, knowing that in this moment, the fate of the wizarding world would be decided. Voldemort's voice carried through the hall, sharp and venomous. his fury at being challenged by a boy burning in every word. His followers stood at his back, though even among them fear flickered. Bellatrix was gone, her madness ended in duel, and with her fell one of his fiercest hands, Lucius Malfoy, once proud, now crouched in silence, his family broken, his loyalty consumed by dread for his son. Other Death Eaters, seeing the tide turn, began to falter, their loyalty trembling in the face of a battle they no longer believed they could win. Harry stood not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. He had faced death and returned, carrying the truth that Voldemort could not understand. Love, sacrifice, and loyalty were powers stronger than fear. As the two faced each other, the hall grew still. Every wand lowered, every breath held. The duel was swift and final. Voldemort, with the Elder Wand in his hand, cast the killing curse, the spell that had defined his reign, the green light that had ended countless lives. Harry answered with a disarming charm, a spell simple yet pure. The twin curses met, light clashing in the air, and then destiny bent. The Elder Wand, bound by loyalty to Harry, refused its master. The curse rebounded, and Voldemort fell, lifeless at last, his body crumpling to the stone floor. The silence that followed was deeper than any before. The Dark Lord was gone, not as shadow or spirit, but as man defeated, his body proof of mortality. For the Death Eaters, it was the end of everything. Their marks still burned on their arms, but it no longer tied them to power. Without their master, their cause collapsed. Some fled in terror, masks torn from their faces as they scrambled into the night. Others surrendered, their wands dropped, their voices pleading for mercy. A few, still burning with fanatic devotion, fought on for moments longer, but even they were struck down or bound in chains. The collapse was not only in battle, but in spirit. For years, the Death Eaters had believed themselves untouchable, their power eternal, their master invincible. With Voldemort's fall, they saw themselves as they truly were, men and women who had traded their souls for fear and ambition, who now stood exposed, their cruelty no longer shielded by his presence. The defenders did not cheer loudly. Their triumph was heavy with grief. Fred Weasley lay still, his laughter silenced. Lupin and Tonks were gone, leaving their son behind. Colin Creevey, far too young, had fallen with wand in hand. The victory was real, but it was written in loss, and the tears of the living were as many as their breaths of relief. The Death Eaters who survived faced justice, but their empire was shattered. Azkaban filled once more, its walls holding the remnants of a fallen movement. Some names were cursed in memory, others forgotten in silence. The Malfoys, spared by Narcissa's defiance, lived diminished, their wealth and pride broken. For those who had once knelt before Voldemort, the collapse was complete. The Battle of Hogwarts was the end, not only of Voldemort, but of the Death Eaters as a force of fear. Their rise had been long, their cruelty deep, their shadow vast. Yet in the end, they fell as all tyrannies do, undone by love, by loyalty, and by the courage of those who refused to bow. The hall that had seen their final stand would forever carry the memory, its stones marked not by scars of spells, but by the knowledge that darkness, no matter how strong, can fall. The sun rose slowly over the ruins of Hogwarts, its light spilling across shattered walls, burned courtyards, and stones still warm from battle. The castle that had stood for centuries bore scars of fire and spell, yet it still stood, a symbol that even war could not break its heart. The cries of battle had faded into silence, replaced by the weeping of the wounded and the mourning of the lost. The Death Eaters were gone, their masks scattered like ash, their empire ended. In the Great Hall, bodies were laid in rows, Friends and families walked among them, their hands trembling, their voices breaking. Fred Weasley, his smile forever stilled, was mourned by a family whose grief was matched only by their love. Lupin and Tonks lay side by side, leaving behind a child who would grow without them, but surrounded by the love of others. Colin Creevey, too young to stand in such a war, lay small among giants, a reminder of how deeply the Death Eaters' cruelty had reached. The victory was real, but it was soaked in loss. The captured Death Eaters were bound and taken into custody. Some wept, their loyalty broken with their master's fall. Others, like the Lestrangers who survived, remained defiant, their eyes wild, even in chains. Azkaban awaited them once more, its gates hungry for the return of prisoners whose fanaticism had outlived their power. A few fled into shadows, vanishing into forests and mountains, but without Voldemort, their cause was hollow, their purpose lost. For the families who had suffered, justice could never be enough. Trials filled the Wizengamot once more, names read aloud, deeds recounted, punishments declared. Some claimed imperious, just as they had after the First War, but this time the world had seen too much, and excuses were harder to accept. The Death Eaters, once feared, now stood exposed as men and women who had hidden behind masks and cruelty, their terror unmasked as weakness. Rebuilding was slow. The Ministry, fractured and hollowed, began to rise again, though trust would take years to mend. Kingsley Shacklebolt became minister, steady and just, a man whose leadership was born not of ambition but of necessity. He promised fairness, and though scars remained, his presence brought hope. Hogwarts itself began to heal. Its walls were repaired, its halls once more filled with laughter. For students who had fought, who had bled, the return to lessons was strange, but the castle's magic was stronger than sorrow. The Sorting Hat sang again, its song of unity carrying new weight, reminding all who listened that division had nearly destroyed them, and only together could they stand. The shadow of the Death Eaters lingered in memory. Families whispered of their cruelty, telling children stories of the mark that had once burned above homes, of the nights when no one felt safe. Their ideology of blood purity did not vanish completely, but it was weakened, its followers fewer, its voice softer. The world had seen what came of such beliefs, and though hatred never truly dies, it found fewer ears willing to listen. For Harry, the war's end marked the beginning of peace, though it was a peace shaped by loss. He walked among the wounded and the fallen, his scar no longer burning, his destiny fulfilled. The boy who lived had become the man who survived, and his survival was proof that darkness can be defeated. The Death Eaters' fall was not only the end of Voldemort's army, it was the end of a generation's nightmare. Yet even in ruin, their story mattered, for it showed what fear can build, what cruelty can spread, and what courage must endure to stand against it. The aftermath of the war was not celebration alone. It was grief, it was rebuilding, it was memory, but above all, it was freedom. The fall of Voldemort ended the terror that had darkened the wizarding world for decades, but the legacy of the Death Eaters did not vanish with his final breath. Their masks were shattered, their master defeated, their power broken, yet the memory of their cruelty remained etched into the lives of those who had endured it. History does not forget so easily, and neither did the families who had suffered under their hand. The Death Eaters left behind a world scarred. Entire families had been erased, names lost, curses in the night. Children grew up without parents, siblings mourned brothers and sisters who never returned, and survivors carried wounds both seen and unseen. The laughter of Bellatrix, the cold smile of Lucius, the piercing cruelty of Dolohov, these were sounds and faces that haunted the memories of a generation. Even in peace, Nightmares carried their echoes. The ideology of blood purity, which Voldemort had sharpened into a weapon, did not disappear entirely. Some still whispered it in hidden corners, passing it down as old belief disguised as tradition. But its voice was weaker now, its power broken by the cost of war. Most of the wizarding world turned away from it, seeing in its name not pride but the memory of ashes. For those who had fought, the proof was clear: unity had saved them, not division. Azkaban became home to many of the surviving Death Eaters, its walls heavy with the despair of men and women who had once worn masks of power. Some remained defiant, clinging to loyalty even in chains. Others sank into silence, their faith broken with their master's fall. A few escaped into exile, shadows in distant lands, but they no longer carried the strength to rise again. They were remnants, fragments of a force that had once ruled Britain, now reduced to memory and warning. The Malfoys lived on, marked forever by their choices. They had survived, but their survival came not from loyalty to Voldemort, but from Narcissa's lie in the forest, her love for Draco outweighing her devotion to the Dark Lord. Their name was stained, their influence diminished, yet they endured as proof of how fear and ambition can bend even the proudest families. The story of the Death Eaters became more than history. It became lesson. Teachers spoke of them in classrooms, not as distant villains, but as reminders of what can grow when fear and hatred are left unchecked. Parents told their children of the mark in the sky, not to frighten, but to warn. The wizarding world, still scarred, learned that vigilance was the price of peace, and that the fight against cruelty is never truly finished. For Harry and his friends, the legacy was personal. They carried the loss of those who had fallen, the weight of battles fought, and the memory of how close the world had come to being lost. Yet they also carried the triumph that proved love is stronger than fear, unity stronger than division, hope stronger than despair. That was the legacy that endured, brighter than any shadow. The Death Eaters had risen twice, their terror stretching across decades, their cruelty touching countless lives. Yet in the end, they fell, undone by the very things they sought to destroy. Their masks, their marks, their ideology, all crumbled before courage, sacrifice, and love. Their story is remembered not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning of what darkness can do, and as proof that even the deepest shadow can be broken by the smallest light. And so the timeline of the Death Eaters closed, not with their power, but with their ruin. The wizarding world carried on, scarred but free, its people walking forward with the knowledge that vigilance and unity would always be needed. For darkness never sleeps forever, yet for that generation at least, the terror had ended. The mark no longer burned in the sky, the laughter of cruelty no longer echoed in the night, and Hogwarts, standing tall once more, became a symbol not of war, but of survival.